for people who have actually spent time looking at what Enda Kenny said in the last few months, he said last March that there was a need for radical reform of our political institutions, proposing, for instance, that we would reduce the number of ministers, junior ministers, from 20 to 12.
Yes.
Radical reform of the committee system. Flagged the Seanad reform issue itself and the McGill speech over the summer. And actually there was a working group within the party that's been working on this very issue. And one of our proposals is the abolition of the Seanad. So the idea, there's a lot of internal discussion in the party about it, even though the public, I suspect, are surprised to see it in the stark form. But now that he's said it, I think the debate has happened, and it's an important debate. We have to get it right, and I think people would expect some kind of leadership, given the scale of the adjustments that we're going to be asking other people to take over the course of the next few years because of the mess that we're in. And the question is, can a country the size of Greater Manchester afford a bicameral system? I think the answer is no, we can't. No, it's not. It's about both, really. And I was one of the co-authors of the last Seanad reform document with Mary O'Rourke when I was leader of our group in the Senate. And I said at the time at the press conference, I remember it well, that if we didn't introduce radical reform quickly, the case for abolition would be much greater. And I think that's the case now. We've had 16 separate reports on reform of the Seanad since 1937. And the idea that any government is now going to introduce reform, I think, is quite daft. I think the government, whatever government of the day, is slow to upset the apple cart. And the reality has been that the Senate has been for people on the way up or people on the way out, as is the case. And the government has never wanted to challenge that. Yet, if you go back to 1979, a referendum was held in our country to extend the voting rights to other non-NUI graduates so that they could vote. That has never been even implemented. Extraordinary inertia. Since 1979, the will of the people has been completely put to one side as a result of the failure to introduce legislation. So I think taking all of that in the round, we have an opportunity now, because the scale of the crisis is so great, an opportunity to make government more effective, to beef up the committee system in the Dáil, to have much more accountable ministerial decision making. Because the mess that we're in at the moment has been part created by the lack of the systems that we have in place, and that's something that has to change. We have a very centralised system. If you're not in the cabinet of 15 or 16 people, you've really no job. That's the problem in our parliamentary system, that the committees aren't taken seriously, the opposition isn't taken seriously. The government backbencher TDs would also express disillusionment that their views aren't being taken particularly seriously either. So in that climate of a very centralised state that we've developed, it's only right and proper that we would look to how we can change that now to make it more efficient and to make sure the decision making is more democratic. And one of the things we've got to do, which we don't really take seriously, is to really get into the mire on all of the issues that come before the European Union. It should be clear that when our government goes to negotiate, they negotiate with a mandate, they negotiate with a proper worked out position that's been articulated to colleagues before they get out there. And also that under the new Parliamentary, for instance, we have the red card and the yellow card rule, which allows decisions to be flagged with the Commission and with the Council if they believe that those decisions are against the European Union. Ultimately, that's great parliamentary new control that we need to use. And I made that point after the recent Lisbon referendum, that not enough has been done to really make the European Union central to our work as legislators in the Dáil. But that will only happen if you get the Dáil working. And you don't need two houses of parliament for that to be established. What have they legislated? How many amendments have been passed by the Seanad? I'll give you an example. When I was Fine Gael opposition leader in the Seanad,
yep,
I had an amendment passed to a social welfare bill on a very important issue to affect the rights of men at the time in our social welfare code. The government hadn't got their numbers on the day, they lost the vote. It was the first vote they lost in the Senate in about 7 years. The next day, on that issue, which was a substantial issue of legislation, the government introduced an amendment revoking my original amendment to the bill. So what's the point in that kind of play action if that's taking place? It doesn't matter how eloquent you are, if you cannot provide the necessary checks and balances to the other house, and for those amendments to be taken seriously, what is the point? And I go back to this point, unless we were prepared to introduce the reform that was required, which we weren't, then the case of abolition becomes a central ground issue. And I think that's what Enda Kenny was reflecting in a speech last Saturday at the City West, when he was saying to us all, in very stark terms, we haven't been able to reform it, we should now go ahead and abolish it, and get on with the task of doing it by way of a referendum. Well, the issue of clientelism, which is effectively the point that Dan O'Brien has been making, is a real problem in our system, and it's largely there because of the PRSTB system, in which you have multi-seat constituencies, often up against people in your own party, ensuring trying to hold your seat, which requires you to do a lot of work in the constituency, sometimes at the loss in terms of what you should be doing nationally. Now, it's not easy to sort this problem out, because the Irish people, in my view, they were given 2 opportunities by De Valera to change this, and they stuck with the tried and tested method of PRSTV. And it's something that is particularly relevant, I think, to Irish people. They want their TDs locally. But I think the responsibility is not so much on people to get the TDs that they want. It's the responsibility of the political parties to produce new faces into politics, and people who have something to say on the national and the local stage. One of the great advantages of our PRSTV system is it forces you into constituencies. Every party or constituency, whether it's a very working class district or a middle class area or a more affluent area, it forces you into all of those areas as a means of trying to compete for votes. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing. That it makes politicians rounded to the entire community. We're not some kind of, I mean, I'm fundamentally against the list system for the Dáil on the basis that I believe the Irish people have a right to select named individuals who they want in their parliament, not a list of preordained people that the General Secretary and others cavort to put on a list, who no one knows, who are answerable to no one. And I think the real challenge is for the party political system to get quality new people into politics. The issue is that they have so many more MPs.
Yes.
They have a historical base for the independence of Parliament, which is something that they cherish as against the kind of all-encompassing, centralising control of the party structures. And I think they're particularly good at defending the right of Parliament to hold ministers and spokespeople to account. For instance, on their committee system, the spokesmen, as I understand it, are even members of those committees. And we depend too much on ministers and spokespeople to lead the debate, rather than on backbench colleagues on all sides. And I think they have that built into the system. Even the selection of their speaker is regarded as an issue which everyone can take a separate view on. And so the party whip is not as significant there. It is on votes of importance to the government, but not so much on issues to do with the independence of Parliament. That's not going to change overnight, though, in the Dáil, I think. We have been slow to introduce a really radical independent committee system. And although where it did happen, for instance, the Jim Mitchell committee, in which he really got to the problem of the bogus non-resident accounts on the dirt issue. And that issue in itself produced, a very good report, got the money back in a short period of time without lawyers near the place. Now, in the Abolition judgment through the Supreme Court, we found our hands are tied in terms of some of the aspects of questioning we can put as parliamentary inquiries go, but we need to address that. But I actually think the role of the inquiry, the independent inquiry led by politicians on a cross-party basis, is something that we need to exploit more. When we did it well in the past, it was a great success.